how is passing speech laws like in some cases criminalize, or at the very least, kick you out of school, pull your federal funding if you criticize Israel?
So recently, Ian Carroll was on Candace Owens' podcast, and the two talked a lot about a lot of interesting subjects, including schisms on the right, especially when it comes to Israel. Now, one thing they also talk about is how Civil War era psyops are back and how that is impacting our culture in general. So let's watch this. Let's react to it.
And this kind of really gets right to the crux of everything that's happening, which is you're seeing actually the left and the right unite on this one topic of recognizing that it's really wrong what's happening in Palestine. And this is such, to me, just a humanitarian issue, humanitarian approach. And they're trying to win this issue with smears. And it's crazy. And you're a perfect example of that. So you've really had, I would say, your come up. I love their narrative that he came out of nowhere. He must be funded. No, actually, he's been on TikTok for quite some time going through grocery aisles. If I know that some older people were not on TikTok, and I'm kind of generation Instagram is where it stopped. But when I finally got on TikTok, and you're a big deal on TikTok.
Blew up
on TikTok, just going through the grocery aisle talking about who owns what. And then when the Israel-Palestine thing happened, you were very clear about your position on this. And obviously, when Elon Musk and you got into that back forth, things hit another level because you were so sensible about speaking about why it is that Americans would not feel allegiance to Israel, which is our right. It is so weird that they think that they're going to try to psychologically convince us that we have no right to not support a foreign nation by calling everybody anti-Semitic.
And then
so to watch them
laws.
and then, we're just going to pass censorship laws. 350 million of you are just not going to be able to say anything bad about Israel.
All you people that think that Jews control the world, you know what we'll do? We'll all pass laws that say you can't say that.
Right.
That'll teach them.
Yeah, that seems like the most counterintuitive policy imaginable, especially after people know this ploy. They lived through the 2024 campaign season when Republicans were saying, hey, we're the champions of free speech. The Hillarys out there, the John Kerrys out there, the Kamala Harrises and Tim Walz's out there, the AOCs are all talking about policing the internet to guard against disinformation. So now what do you get? You get the right-wing flavor of trying to do the same thing when it comes to being critical of Israel. Just smear all of Israel's critics as anti-Semites. It's a one-size-fits-all solution. And I think people are really waking up to how absurd that thought process is, that people aren't buying this anymore like they may have, or people aren't being as afraid to express anti-Israeli sentiment anymore for fear of being called an anti-Semite, because we've seen that they'll do this not to just Christians or people that aren't Jews. They've done this to Glenn Greenwald and Max Blumenthal and Norm Finkelstein and all sorts of people that are Jewish critics of Israel.
Like, clearly these people have never taught young kids. When you teach young kids, you learn that you can't tell young kids, like, you can't do that double think with young people these days. They see right through it. And it only enhances their conviction and actually creates more real anti-Semitism, as well as just, basic noticing of facts.
There is that noticing of facts that's happening. I think this book here has done more damage than anything that you or I could ever say. And I actually wanted to bring up this book, Chaos, because they are totally chaos. But just to be clear for you guys that are watching us at home, it was a CIA operation. And they're doing it right now. So if you're wondering why all of these random accounts are suddenly saying that I'm funded by Qatar, I absolutely am not funded by Qatar. I'd like to be, by the way, Qatar, if you're watching, like, I'm not opposed to reading some ads for you. Like, it's totally fine because everybody else works with you, including Bibi Netanyahu, who's going through a Qatar trial right now, which is the rich irony of all of this. You're not funded by Qatar.
No, I'm not funded by anyone. I'm poor.
So this is amazing.
So that's one of the biggest ironies, too, and you see it all over the Twitter sphere right now, if that's a word, that people are saying that there's so much Qatari influence in government. This is indistinguishable in my mind from when leftists were saying, hey, the Russians own the U.S. government. There's way too much Russian influence in the U.S. government. Meanwhile, as we know from Thomas Massey's revelations, AIPAC assigns an agent to every single member of Congress to keep them in line, except for Massey, because he's shooed that person away. He can't be bought. And our foreign policy happens to coincidentally match all of Netanyahu's preferences. There's no doubt that Israel has far more influence in the U.S. government than any other country, including Qatar. This is a crazy psyop right now, a total scheme, and it's so easy to see through, but you see a lot of Zionist accounts leaning into this Qatari narrative right now. It's crazy.
I was reading this because I do a book club here. The chaos was born out of LBJ's, the chaos CIA program was born out of LBJ. So JFK gets shot. LBJ becomes president of the United States and just reverses course on everything that JFK was doing in terms of his foreign policy with Israel. And he's getting them weapons, he's getting them money, he wants war. So we're right back in that circumstance where it's like war. We're talking about war with Iran. And then there were these natural student protests that were happening because people were against the Vietnam War. And LBJ didn't believe that these could be organic protests. He believed that if they needed to seed the public with this idea that these protests were actually a foreign infiltration. And so they began this Operation Chaos to discredit people by pretending that they were foreign operators. Yeah. And that's exactly what they're doing to me, you, and Tucker right now. And it's just amazing. And I'm like, guys, this is like, you don't just randomly just say, Candance is funded by Qatar, Ian's funded by Qatar. They're all saying the same talking point, but while ignoring Bibi Netanyahu's trial for funding Qatar to give money to Hamas.
Yeah, this is a classic ploy of warmongers to always associate any of the anti-war dissidents that happen to disagree with the policy of regime change or military strikes in that theater by just likening them to collaborators with the enemy. If you were against the war in Iraq, you were just pro-Saddam. They said this routinely. I'm embarrassed because I was a neocon in those early 2000 years, and I said similar things. It's so embarrassing now, but I fell into that trap too, and that's what you still hear from these people and the neocons. They said, hey, if you oppose the war in Vietnam, well, you're a communist sympathizer. If you don't want to occupy Afghanistan for years and years and years, even after the Taliban's being eliminated, well, you're probably a secret Al-Qaeda sympathizer. You must have it in for bin Laden. You must have been won over by bin Laden's ideology. This is crazy. You're seeing the same thing today. I'm sure that not all protests that have ever transpired when it comes to the Israel issue are organic, but I do think a lot of them are legitimate. People are seeing these images coming out of Gaza, and every piece of every person, no matter how Zionist, there has to be some piece of people that realize this is wrong on some level. Some of them know it and can't admit it because of how tied they are to Israel and the Israel lobby. But there are a lot of people with legitimate qualms against this war, and they're not all being funded by Soros, I'm sorry to say, for those that buy into that whole thing.
Which is incredible.
So damning in so many ways. And it's not to mention that, so Chaos is the one where they're like surveilling and targeting and smearing and libeling these protesters, but that's overlapped over COINTELPRO, which was instated by J. Edgar Hoover, more so, although COINTELPRO tactics are universal. But that's actually causing dissidents to fight each other, causing spreading rumors about Black Panthers sleeping with each other's wives, spreading, salacious details that may or may not be true about Martin Luther King or other things. And
by the way, he's totally right. COINTELPRO is one of the most criminal schemes of the FBI. It allowed for warrantless wiretapping of dissidents, including Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. Now, that said, it is true that Martin Luther King had adulterous liaisons, and even his right-hand man, Ralph Abernathy, admitted this. Abernathy spent countless time with King, including right up until his assassination. And he said in his book before he died, I think Abernathy died in 2010 or something like that. Or no, I think he might have died in the 90s, actually. But Abernathy basically said that on the eve of his death, Martin Luther King actually had adulterous liaisons with 2 women. That's in Abernathy's book. And corroborating this is one of those women, Georgia Davis Powers, who was a senator in Kentucky, who wrote in her book that she had an affair with King. Now, supposedly in the FBI letter that was sent to King to try to convince him to commit suicide, which was done, by the way, it included tapes which were alleged to have proven King's infidelities. Apparently, this was seen by Coretta Scott King, but she hasn't said much about them. There's not much known about them, but I do think there are files related to MLK that are due to be released in just a few years, because there was a 50-year stay on that by a federal judge a long time ago, but those should still be divulged. We'll see. But that's just my tangent on that part.
To be clear, a lot of the rumors about Martin Luther King were probably somewhat true, but just sowing division amongst the ranks and getting people to fight each other so you can, and that was all enacted by J. Edgar Hoover, who was being blackmailed by the Jewish mob for his sexual perversions at the time. And so it's such a funny and tragic rewrite of like the exact same history as rhyming all over again in so many ways.
The Bible says there's nothing new under the sun.
Yeah.
And I feel like we are right back in the 60s.
Yeah.
And I want people to recognize that, because I got a chill down my spine reading about the Black Panthers and COINTELPRO, and recognizing that they infiltrated these groups because their biggest fear, and this was the entire thing behind the Charles Manson lie and pretending it was a race war that he wanted, was they were very fearful of Black nationalists and white liberals coming together. And I was sitting here going, oh my gosh, I have these beliefs. Like, they're going through Black Panthers beliefs in this book, and they're like, they believed in the Second Amendment, that you should defend yourself. They didn't trust the government. They believed in, like, they needed to keep like their families together, and they freaked out when people on the left began supporting them. They didn't want union, so they wanted to sow racial discord. And I think about why so many liberals hated me, because they thought I was like a self-hating Black person. And I'm going, guys, read this book. Like, the CIA is doing this all over again, trying to discredit and trying to sow discord. And we really need to like stay together right now.
100.
This is so true. And you saw this actually emerge in the late 2000s as well, when the Occupy movement was rising and the Tea Party movement was rising. And guess what their common enemy was? The financial system. They didn't want these TARP bailouts to the richest countries or the richest companies in the world after the economic collapse. And there was actually vitriol on both the right and the left against the Federal Reserve System for one of the first times that I ever observed it. Ron Paul spoke gospel about how criminal that enterprise was during his first presidential run. And because they seem to align on this, that's when you've seen a lot of these tactics be deployed, and really the beginnings of the modern culture war, splitting these people down through cultural wedges. We got a lot of the race war and war against women rhetoric coming out of, intelligence campaigns at that time. If you do LexisNexis search, you can see a lot of the woke terminology had its start in those first 20-10 years. Right around Ferguson, Missouri is when it really took off. And you saw a lot of this attempt to draw wedges between people that would otherwise unite, not only when it came to the financial system, but also when it came to wars and non-intervention. So I think we're seeing the same thing play out in some ways right now, just like in the 60s.
100%. And it ties into the thing that initially brought us together in content was Diddy, is that once they saw how powerful these Black movements could be, because Black people have had such a bad go of it politically in those earlier days especially, and then through the civil rights movement they saw, oh my goodness, these people can really organize, these people can really project quality arguments and make a difference. We need to figure out, and I'm speculating a little bit as to the connections from A to B, but you wind up with Black culture being propped up by a whole bunch of blackmailers and really corrupt celebrities that are pulling strings in order to promote the most degenerate artists you could ever promote, in order to promote culture that is a direct pipeline to prison, which is basically used as slave labor today by all the biggest corporations like Starbucks, McDonald's, Verizon. Like, you're calling your Verizon sales rep, and some of those calls are going into prisons to people that are getting paid like cents per hour. And so the way that the Black community has been undermined since the sort of 80s and 90s through rap music is a big part of it, is so tragic. And I think that the seeds are sowed in that time period of the Black Panthers being such a threat, not a physical, violent threat in most cases, but rather a political threat.
Yeah, and that's really funny, because I was reading a passage in the book club yesterday or the day before, and it speaks about how part of this program, they infiltrated the Black Panthers and had a guy who got really close with the guy at the top. I think his name was Freddie, one of the guys at the top. And for months, Freddie basically said they're not doing anything illegal, right?
Yeah.
And they're not doing anything illegal. They're not doing anything illegal. And they didn't care. And one night they had him drug him. And the FBI raided and shot him in the back of the head and killed him. just because he had a following. And this is what they were worried about with Martin Luther King. And so the biggest fear that they have is nationalism, like true America first. We don't want to be involved in your war. We don't care about what's happening in Vietnam. We don't care how close you are to Israel, LBJ, and the unity that could come between white people and Black people. And so I really recommend people that are listening to this to read this book so that you have an understanding. It will force you to re-examine your relationship with the media when they're kind of using these tactics against people that are clearly not being funded by foreign nations. Like, they're just going to accuse us of exactly what it is that they're doing, which is committing themselves to a foreign nation. I do want to circle back.
By the way, you know, the stalwart champion of modern conservatism, I can't talk today, Ronald Reagan imposed gun control because of Black Panthers carrying openly in California. That was the driving impetus for some of California's most stringent and rigid gun control measures while Reagan was governor. So that's what can be said to conservatives that laud that man on every issue imaginable. He certainly wasn't a friend to gun rights.
Because of that, to the point about RFK, because I will say, I kind of think, and this could just be me, and this is going to get people upset, but when I examine everything that I know about RFK's death, JFK's death, the truth behind those deaths, I do think he's a coward. I do think there is no way you would have me wrapped in an Israeli flag running around with Rabbi Shmuley with the lingering questions and the facts that we have about what happened with these two particular murders. And I just say that for me, like, I would have to die on my feet. Like, I couldn't do it. You know?
I do. I always try to remind myself that there's factors I don't know at play. There's factors that I might not understand. But at the same time, you are right that how grievous would those factors have to be for them to legitimize this sort of an action from RFK Jr. based upon what we know, like what he knows about Sirhan Sirhan. And like, that's his dad that Sirhan Sirhan allegedly killed, right? And you did a great piece on that the other day. And it is tragic that I assume, my presumption is that there's a compromise being made in his mind of, I can put this issue to the side if it allows me to tackle this issue, being like the vaccines and the health and all that. But then the problem is that I put out that video that blew the world up, and I'm getting contacted by like Maha moms that have been involved in the movement for 10 years and by other people that were in the campaign. And one of the main like rumor mill concerns is that the vaccine stuff seems to not be being taken seriously.
Yeah, for sure. It seems like RFK Jr. has spent most of his tenure as HHS so far not trying to improve health and, you know, promote wellness and exercise and things like that, but combating what he calls one of the most serious threats to civilization, and that's anti-Semitism. He's tweeted about it multiple times from his HHS account, as if that's really even his role in the government. But just to get back to what they were talking about, there have been times where RFK Jr. has denied that Sirhan was really the killer of his father, but at other times he's been a little bit ambiguous. There's alternative theories involved. But yeah, this is very strange, and I think Ian has it right that it must be a compromise in his head if he is being blackmailed or directed in some way, or if he's compromised at least partially. Maybe he thinks he can get done enough good in one realm that he does have to sacrifice some in some others. But either way, it's a pretty big disappointment from someone here who liked a lot of what RFK Jr. had to say on some critical issues, especially Ukraine and especially the deep state and the CIA. But, you know, watching RFK Jr. tweet about the merits of the mRNA measles vaccines, like, that was a little bit nerve-wracking, and I can see why so many people are apprehensive about him so far in office.
Seems like we are diverting to food over and over and over, which is good, and that's great, and I'm happy we're getting food dye out of our food. But let's be real. Millions of people were harmed and killed by this bioweapon that we know now was engineered by our government and our deep state, and then was leaked out of a lab that we were running. And then the vaccines were also already like funded and helped make, like the CIA helped make the mRNA technology that was used in those vaccines. And then the liability shields, like the amount of evidence that is being compiled as to the multi-billion-dollar profit and the multi-million-dollar death toll of this scam. And we're in that window right now where if they get away with it, like I said, it's like a post-2008 feeling to me, where if we let them get away with it for enough years, no one's going to ever be held accountable, and they're going to just go free with their billion-dollar paychecks and no one held accountable.
Right.
And I can't help but wonder if the Maha movement has been infiltrated in some way in order to make compromises that you can do this, but not this. You can get this done, but it's just politics. This is just how it works.
This is my biggest fear, too, that all the crimes from the COVID regime will essentially stand as precedent to be revived in the future whenever the next government emergency is declared. Like, it might be over the environment. There's an existential environmental threat, or there's a gun threat. So because of that, we have to enact all these draconian lockdown procedures and policies again. And guess what? Hey, take a look at the precedents. We didn't prosecute anyone for that. And even Santorum supported it in Florida. They can point to the most Republican people imaginable in support of a lot of this madness, at least at the start, to justify the revival against it. That's the biggest trepidation I have when it comes to some of these things going forward. And Ian is totally right here.
And I guess we just can't, whoopsies, I guess the vaccine thing is too controversial to do now.
Which is crazy. Like, this is the entire reason that people got behind him, was to deal with this, to give parents choice when it comes to vaccines. Like, to say, no, actually, no, you can't compel children and babies to get vaccines in order for them to be able to go to school and things of that nature. And all of it's taking, it seems to me, a backseat. And I would say, by the way, as an extension of that, also the MAGA movement. It sort of feels like they're doing the bare minimum for Americans and what we actually put them in office for, and then doing the absolute maximum for like Bibi Netanyahu's entire agenda, while being like, oh, but look, we did, at least Tom Homan did get out 2,000 criminals in the border. We've stopped it. And we've asked you for a lot more. The mandate was a lot more. And
this is so right. I think this is the best point Candace Owens has made so far this podcast. There's this thing called Horton's Law. Scott Horton drew this up. He said that whenever a politician wins their presidential election, they're guaranteed to keep all of the bad pledges that they made during their campaign, but disregard all the good ones that they made. And I've seen that here through this, certainly when it comes to Doge. Now Doge is supposedly flirting with only being able to save about $150 billion, which the projections were much higher before. And the Pentagon budget is being expanded, about that much anyway, so the savings are a net zero essentially, and you're really not getting much savings out of all the rhetoric, out of all these theatrics about after all the attacks on Musk. And I do think Musk is trying the best he can, but there isn't the political will among the Republicans, even the right-wing establishment that supports Trump. They passed the Trump CR that continued Biden level funding and dragged Massey over it. They can't be counted on for what they're elected to do, not only in regard to the Maha stuff, but also in regard to spending and other things. And of course, she's right about what she says about Israel, too.
And you seem to have, in just 3 months, done so much for Israel. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
If we could dedicate that same energy to what you promised everyone that you were going to do for Americans, that would be great. But once again, we're left feeling like this is just a slave colony.
Yeah. And the fact that the movement is called America First originally, and that is a stroke of genius because it is so hard. They're trying their best, but it's so hard to make what they're doing look America first. And they're trying to do all these backwards arguments. Like, how is passing speech laws that like in some cases criminalize, or at the very least, kick you out of school, pull your federal funding if you criticize Israel? There are no laws about racism in America. If you Google right now, there is no recognized definition of racism by our government. But if you Google America's official definition of anti-Semitism, there's a whole page on the State Department's website about anti-Semitism. And so how do you call this America First when we are explicitly going against our First Amendment of our Constitution?
This is so right. And just like the left wanted to rebrand vaccines to include or mean mRNA treatment, the right wants to rebrand anti-Semitism to mean any critique of Israel on anything, on any topic. That's where we've gotten to, and the right is really turning its back in many ways on this by supporting hate speech laws when it comes to Israel.
On behalf of a different nation. And inside of those guidelines, they specifically say that saying that Jewish people would have more allegiance to Israel than to America because they're Jewish, that's anti-Semitic to say,
Crazy.
while out of their mouths, they're saying, we need to do these things for Israel, or like, I am a Jew first above all else. Things like that are like, how are we going along with this cognitive dissonance?
Yeah, obviously, I mostly agree with Candace and Ian here. They're right on the mark. There is a special carve out for Israel that we're seeing from this administration, and it's a pretty big bummer. A lot of us knew that the Israel lobby owned Trump and owned, some of his most fierce political loyalists, but a lot of us didn't realize that it had gone this deep, where they would start to support anti-free speech and support hate speech laws when it comes to anti-Semitism, which they will always define as criticism toward Israel. So I want to hear what you guys think about it, though. Let me know in the comments below. Do you think that Ian Carroll and Candace Owens are right about this? And until I see you guys next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and no more empire. Take it easy, guys. Peace out.